Things off with the introductions. So my name is Michael Tigwell. I'm Chief Operating Officer at Benefex. I've worked in the benefits technology industry for close to 25 years now, both in the UK and also globally as well. My role today will be bringing more of a UK domestic perspective to some of the research and some of our findings.
It's great, it tees me up perfectly. So by way of introduction, my name is Adam Mason. I'm the Exec VP here at Benefex. My responsibility is really around developing our kind of global proposition, specifically in the context of today's session. I guess I'm going to try and bring to life some of my practical experiences working with a number of our global customers, and hopefully drawing out some of the nuances between kind of the UK and global market.
Great, so just to provide a little bit more context around what we'll cover today, as you can see on the screen, there's a QR code where you can download the latest copy of the research that we have conducted over the past few months. So every year at Benefex, we go out to hundreds of organisations across the world, thousands of employees, and we measure their perspectives and the changing trends when it comes to reward, benefits and employee experience. And I think it's fair to say over the past couple of years, both during the pandemic and as we've come out of the other side, we've seen some shifting expectations when it comes to employees' perceptions around how organisations should support them. So when we look back to 2022, the trends were largely around this idea that employees had really started looking towards their employers to be more responsible for their holistic health and well-being, their life inside of work as well as their life outside of work. And what we found throughout the course of our 2023 research is that a lot of these trends are still prevalent. However, they are shifting and accelerating in certain areas. So today, whilst the research is very broad, I'd recommend you download it and absorb sort of the full breadth of the study that we've undertaken. Today, we'll be picking out a few of those core trends as it relates to benefits and their place in the wellbeing spectrum. So just to kick things off, I guess one of the things that really struck us, and has really struck us really since the pandemic, has been this shift in focus towards employee well-being, which, given some of the events of recent history, is fully to be expected. But also like the renaissance when it comes to benefits and benefits' role in supporting and providing well-being to employees. As you can see from our research, the expectation that employers will be responsible for the well-being of the employee continues to be the #1 driver for someone picking an organisation to work for in the first place. And unsurprisingly, at least from our point of view, that correlates highly with their expectations around benefits provision, which stands to reason if you believe, as we do, that effectively, benefits is a subset of well-being itself. Every benefit an organisation provides to its employees ultimately either directly or indirectly impacts the well-being of that employee. Now, employee well-being is a fairly broad description and means different things to different people, I think it's fair to say. So when we try and get a little bit more specific around what is the definition of well-being, what are the things that we should be considering as employers, our research shows that actually the expectation from employees isn't that they've got one aspect of well-being in mind. They're not thinking, when I say well-being, I purely mean my physical health. The research shows that actually employees expect the full spectrum, all those pillars of well-being to be catered for. So whilst on the right-hand side, you can see that there is a small difference in terms of the importance given to those top 5 benefits that the employees said were most important to them. really, they are pretty much all on a par, and they effectively reflect this idea that employees have an equal expectation that whether it's financial well-being, whether it's mental well-being, whether it's physical well-being, that the employer has a responsibility and it will be valued as far as the provision of benefits that support those things go. So what's really key here is that I think during the pandemic, we saw a trend as an organisation where companies realised that they needed to offer something holistic from a wellbeing point of view. The tendency tended to be to pick sort of benefits that largely fell within these themes, but without really thinking about how they interacted together, without really thinking about, are we designing a wellbeing program that truly caters for each stage of someone's wellbeing journey, or are we just picking disparate benefits, chucking them into a flex scheme, and hoping that that ticks the box in terms of employee requirements? Adam, I don't suppose you would add any sort of different lenses from a global point of view. What's your take in terms of wellbeing benefits?
Yeah, I think interestingly, one of the things we've seen is that organisations, when they're looking at their global benefit provision, are mindful that the actual benefits that they offer in each market will vary. It's very difficult to find a single benefit that spans each of the individual geographies. What we are seeing happen, I guess, particularly in the context of these pillars, is the pillars almost being used to create that framework with which you think about the design of benefits as a whole. So if I take the example of something like financial well-being and potentially a retirement plan as well, how you would deliver a retirement benefit in the UK would look very different to how you might deliver it in Singapore, for example. In Singapore, it's much more mandated as a kind of state requirement with a set level of contributions. But actually, what we're seeing organisations try and do is, when they're thinking about communicating their global benefit offering, the pillars almost become that glue to think about, actually, how am I supporting my employees consistently, even if the actual vehicle for providing that support is different in each of the markets. I think it's also one of those things where, when you're talking about each of these pillars, it just tends to give those benefits a little bit more relevance and meaning for the employees. So actually talking about, a critical illness benefit or an AD&D, for example, it doesn't really translate in terms of the relevance to an employee sometimes, whereas actually talking about the benefits in the context of these pillars makes these benefits seem much more meaningful and relevant to the whole host of demographics. So I think, going back to your point, seeing the renaissance of certain benefits, things that maybe weren't seen as attractive or sexy in terms of jumping off the page, I think people are a lot more aware of their kind of the risks that exist to them, and this is a great way of trying to draw out some of those individual themes.
And I think, as for all of the reasons we've sort of discussed up to this point, well-being is a really difficult thing to pigeonhole, because it does mean different things to different people. I'd say there are a myriad of offerings out there in the market. However, knitting those together, making those come together in a program that really makes sense for the individual, can be really challenging. So interestingly, one of the emerging trends that we're seeing is the propensity for organisations around the world to offer a wellbeing allowance, or effectively a pot of money that can be spent on anything wellbeing related. Adam, I'm interested in understanding, is this driven by sort of local norms in certain regions, or is this a wider trend that we're starting to see potentially as a replacement for certain benefits?
Yeah, look, I think, without doubt, these allowances were born out of APAC as a region, and definitely were kind of a core part of the proposition when we look back historically. I think for a lot of organisations, when you talk about this idea of kind of hyper-personalisation and flexibility, this is where, for lots of organisations, they begin to see how practically you can do that, and that makes a big difference. So, as I say, whilst they may have been historically focused around that APAC region, it's very, very commonplace now for organisations to be saying, actually I want to deliver a benefit globally, and rather than going out and sourcing, individual benefits in each of those markets, going through a kind of onerous level of kind of sourcing and compliance to get those particular benefit vendors approved. Actually, this is almost a very practical way of being able to apply that. So I think the interesting thing we've seen is, they're born out of APAC with specific costs typically in mind, being applied much more globally. We're seeing organisations really sort of challenge, actually, what could they be used for? How might they be adopted? And even organisations having multiple different allowances, I think that's becoming much more commonplace, born off the success and engagement. I think when you look at the data, what's really, really interesting is this tends to be, without doubt, one of the most kind of engaging benefits for employees, simply because actually it can mean such a different thing to one employee versus another employee, for example. The one I always love to talk about, and I've probably used this on a couple of webinars in the past, so I'll go through it at a reasonable pace, but we had one particular customer who still talks to the fact that actually during the pandemic they'd introduced a wellbeing allowance, and actually they'd had some fantastic testimonials coming back from a number of their employees, one of whom had spoken very much about how they'd use this allowance to buy a slide. Just to give you some comfort, it wasn't for their consumption, this slide, but actually, one of the things that they were really struggling with during the lockdown period was actually finding ways of kind of keeping their kids entertained, particularly in that kind of constrained period. So I think it's a good example of how organisations are being quite creative with the benefit they're providing, and the allowance is almost giving that hyper-personalised approach. I think the other big piece of probably, we talked a little bit about trends across different markets. One of the questions we posed during the research was actually, how have your expectations changed at work in the past 12 months? Now, actually, you can see some fairly telling statistics there in terms of employees' expectations having increased. And I think that probably resonates with everything that we're seeing, through our own kind of practical day-to-day of managing those employees across different geographies. I think one thing that was particularly interesting from the research was actually some of the disparities in terms of different geographies. When although if you take that first trend, 52% of employees cited that their expectations had increased around benefits. Actually, it's interesting to see how that varies. So if you take somewhere like India, for example, we actually saw that number rise to 65%. And I think some of that reflects some of the fairly material shifts we're seeing in that market at the moment, where organisations are starting to offer more flexibility and choice around the benefits, and being much more employee focused in terms of being able to offer some of the choices and flexibility compared to what you look back maybe previously.
And I think this part of the research shows that there is definitely more to do. So we're talking about the increasing expectations year on year that employees have of their employers. 51% a year ago said that the employee experience they were receiving was excellent. Like that has dropped significantly in the past 12 months. And there's probably a lot of reasons for this. Adam's just talked about changing expectations, and despite all of the focus on employee experience, it sounds like there is room for us as employers to do more. However, I would say giving ourselves a little bit of a break, but still, outlining the challenge ahead. We're now faced with a world where you have some organisations that have reverted entirely back to 100% in the office. You've got some that have transitioned to 100% remote, and you probably have a core of organisations, a bit like ourselves, where you've embraced some form of hybrid, and it might be mandated hybrid. You've got to spend these 2 days in the office a week. It could be much more flexible, so a minimum number that people need to meet or whatever. I guess the point is there's no standard. So for an employee and as an employer, the world is slightly more confusing. An employee has more choice potentially in terms of who they go and work for. Some friends of mine who have recently been looking for jobs, interestingly, when I asked them sort of what they're looking for in terms of their next position, one of the first things that I think most of them have quoted is, I need a job that allows me to work in this style or this flexibility or this many days at home. which is a completely new concept for many organisations in terms of that flexibility that people are providing. I think, because of the challenges of hybrid, because of the challenges of trying to meet everyone's expectations with one policy, providing a really compelling remote or hybrid experience that is consistent for all is really, really difficult. So yes, some of this is changing employee expectations. I also think a chunk of this is just the fact that trying to cater for everyone in a changing workplace has become ever more difficult for employers as well. One really good example, just to bring this to life, so we work with the AA in the UK, so emergency breakdown services employ about 7,000 people across the country, and over 3,000 of those are people out on patrol. So this is something that they've actually struggled with in terms of the differing employee experience for the people out on patrol versus those in the office. And they've invested a huge amount of time to try and understand and provide an experience that really caters for all. So they've observed over the past couple of years that ultimately, when they're looking to attract and retain staff, the world has got a much more competitive place. Employees are starting to reflect more on what's important to them. And they are faced with the challenge that, their mechanics, their people that work out on patrol, for example, now have the option to be able to go and work 9 to 5 in a local garage. Many of them have decided that, for example, that work-life balance is more important to them than some of the traditional career offerings that an organisation like the AA could previously cater for. So the AA have put in a huge amount of work to try and create a platform where it drives a feeling of belonging and engagement for all employees. Ultimately, when they think about a new joiner, they think about this experience of, hey, if they go and work in a garage, for example, they're part of a team, they get a high-touch onboarding experience, whereas, working out on patrol can be a fairly lonely experience. So they've been working with Benefex, one, to broaden out that benefits offering and make sure that actually, whereas traditionally they focus largely on head office staff when it came to traditional benefits, that they've realised that actually there is a requirement across their organisation. So they've broadened out the range of benefits, they've made it available to all employees, but then they've created these spaces online to really enhance that new joiner experience, really help them feel like they're part of the team, help them engage and connect with the values of the organisation, even though they don't have the luxury of those personal one-on-one relationships that they might get in a physical workspace. So really, really interesting case study. There's a lot more about the AA on our website, including great presentation they did at our customer forum recently.
I think the interesting thing is that challenge, I guess, extends when you start thinking about those global organisations. So, I was conscious that you were talking about the AA there, but actually I think, one of the other examples I'd probably cite from a global perspective is the work that we've been doing with Baker Hughes. Now, for those of you who are familiar with Baker Hughes as an organisation, it's gone through multiple different business transformations and corporate events over the kind of last 5 to 6 years. One of the key things for them as they step forward is really looking to articulate that kind of EVP and their brand to employees. And I think this idea of, using the brand and the sense of purpose as a kind of core fundamental of the experience that you're trying to create, so you enable people to feel part of that organisation, is something that we're definitely seeing organisations really double down and think harder about in terms of, if this employee is potentially remote and I may not come into contact with them for months, or potentially I may only come into contact with them, once a quarter or something like that. How do I use the tools at my disposal to, articulate the kind of core principles of the brand that I'm trying to create and what it means to be a Baker Hughes employee? So a lot of the work that Magdalena and the team, who, again, as Michael said, there's a lot of resources that sit on our website that talk about this Baker Hughes case study, but a lot of the work they've been doing at the moment is just thinking about how do they bring that experience to life? How do they make people feel a part of something? And whether it's because they're out on patrol, I guess in your example, or whether it's just that they're kind of dotted across, the kind of 70 plus countries that Baker Hughes have. There's a real challenge there for organisations to embrace in terms of how you make those employees feel part of something as you step forward.
Okay, so we've looked at the things that our research shows employees are valuing most. This idea, the resurgence of some benefits that, as I think Adam articulately put, used to be classified as not particularly exciting, unsexy, are now sort of being viewed through a new lens of sort of value and importance when it comes to people's well-being. We were to flip that and look at what are employees saying frustrates them the most. What's clear is this idea that perhaps the organisations they work for are out of touch and don't quite understand their needs. Adam, can you provide your view on what the research is telling us?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there, isn't there? Frustration is always a bit of a dangerous word, but I guess here what we're really trying to draw out is, I guess, the frustrations for employees when they're looking to provide those benefits to their employees. I think one of the pieces that definitely is drawn out is this idea of actually having the ability to source the benefits that really resonate with your employees. And I think this idea of flexibility and choice is definitely something that that they're grappling with in terms of, can I actually find the vehicle to provide that? So we've got a couple of icons down the bottom there. I think what's interesting is we're certainly seeing more global organisations look to do, whether it's surveys or focus groups, to really understand actually what's most relevant to an employee. One jumps to mind. We've got a global organisation that actually looked to run focus groups over 12 of its territories. And what was really interesting for them as they were going through the process of those focus groups is there was a key understanding point for them, which was actually for a lot of employees, they didn't actually understand the benefits that they were entitled to today. So rather than, there may have been this perception that the benefits weren't valued, what they were starting to uncover was that actually the very benefits that they were spending the money on actually weren't necessarily as understood. People didn't understand their entitlement or their eligibility to funding, for example. And so what they were hearing from employees wasn't, I need you to add another 10 benefits to my package. When they started to unpack some of the benefits that they had through these focus groups, they started to understand that education was a really key activity for them stepping forward and thinking about what those communications look like. So on one hand, I think the role of listening is just making sure that the messages that you're looking to land, particularly globally, are really landing. And some of that may also be thinking about how you equip your teams in each of those markets to deliver those messages, because many of you on this call, for example, won't have a benefits team in every single country in which you have a presence. So how are you arming some of those key stakeholders, whether it's line managers, for example, with those key messages that you want to ensure that every single employee hears? So that again may be a further extension of this communication point. The other bit I think organisations, and another example that I can think of that comes to mind is sometimes it's the things that don't necessarily jump to mind that have the greatest value to employees. So actually, in this same focus group, actually what they were able to identify was that transportation was by far the biggest impact. It wasn't the retirement plan, wasn't even the medical policy, for example, but actually it was just trying to get into work that was causing this huge both frustration to them in terms of their experience, but also could have the most material impact in terms of perceived value or benefit. So that particular organisation simply went as far as offering a range of buses into the office going forward. Relatively low cost for them to deliver, but in terms of the kind of reception that it received in terms of making that change, a huge impact for some of those employees. So I think when we talk about the frustration of not knowing whether something is relevant, one of the best ways of understanding the relevance is just really through that listening, and there are a range of ways in which we can look to do that. I think the other piece that I'd probably draw out, if I may, is just around this idea of personalisation. We touched upon this a little bit earlier on, but it's something that for me is definitely a kind of sea change that we're starting to see when organisations are thinking about benefits. And by that I mean, there are the types of benefits that are long-standing that organisations have historically provided for many, many years. These contractual benefits, some of the risk and medical plans, where you as an organisation are going out and sourcing those providers, working through the due diligence to make sure that you've got the very best policy, and ultimately going back in kind of what is a very paternalistic way and offering those benefits to employees. I think we've started to see this idea of discounts and making net pay go further as the kind of extra limb of benefits that maybe weren't necessarily tagged as benefits historically. So we're seeing it much more common, for organisations to think about how they support in the cost of living challenges that we have at the moment. How do I make my net pay go further? I think what we'll continue to see, and we touched upon this earlier on, is this kind of middle ground of this idea of how do we maybe potentially provide some form of alliances, some form of flexibility. So we talked about it earlier on, this idea of wellbeing funds. I guess what we're trying to do in this part of the session is really talk about the art of the possible and how might you take this further. The range of allowances may be extended, for example, but also thinking about how you might be more creative with the allowances that you provide today. We've definitely seen that from some organisations where they may already have a committed spend, for example, but they're just thinking a little bit more creatively about how they're providing those spends. But as HR and reward professionals, I think there's a real opportunity to just take a step back and almost begin to map out, actually, how do my current global benefits map across each of these categories, and is there an option to deliver something in a slightly different way, but to ultimately get to a much stronger outcome?
Okay, revisiting this list of frustrations, I guess, particularly bearing in mind we are now in 2023, surprising that we still see this trend around time spent on admin, being reactive, firefighting. For those of you that have worked in this industry for any amount of time, it feels like an age-old conversation that we're having around like how do we reduce some of that burden on HR reward professionals.
Yeah, I mean, I think interestingly, one of the things we definitely hear is this concern from employers in terms of, actually, if I offer more benefits, that's just going to create more of an admin headache than I currently have today. And so when you're talking about the idea of how do I offer more flexibility and more choice, in the back of everyone's mind, I think, is that understanding that it can't be at the cost of either the process being not robust enough from a compliance perspective or not robust enough in terms of how do I actually administer it and make sure that it's scalable as we step forward. So yeah, I think what's really interesting, in some of the research, when you look at what are the drivers for, employees in terms of looking to benefits technology, choice is definitely one of them. I think some of that is around that scalability point. But this idea of reducing administration, making something much more, much more compliant, it's telling, I think, to see those things feature as highly in the trend. And I think, it's probably worth calling out that when we talk about the prevalence of global benefits technology, we're quite privileged in terms of working with a whole host of global brands to provide technology globally, but actually it's still a relatively fast-growing but emerging kind of trend for an organisation to have delivered something truly globally. And even if you look at some of the data points here, those organisations that do have systems, typically they're quite disparate, disconnected, spread across a whole host of different geographies. So I think it's probably quite telling for us that when we've been working with organisations to kind of underpin the business cases that they've been putting together for benefits technology. Yes, absolutely. The North Star tends to be, or the thing that really excites that organisation about the technology or a global benefits technology, is the ability to create a global experience. I think what's interesting is that for a lot of organisations, they're taking the opportunity to really sort of start to think about how they quantify some of those benefits of global benefits technology. to sort of underpin the business case that they're putting forward to a chief finance officer, for example. I'm sure you've all got it in your organisation, that chief CFO who's kind of faced with a number of different investment cases from across the business. You're desperately trying to kind of convey that this is the most important investment that they can make. And what we're starting to see, actually sort of aligned to those frustration points, is HR and reward professionals really thinking about how they quantify some of those pain points. So, for example, how much time do I currently spend answering very standard queries from employees when actually I might be able to provide them a kind of self-service route to be able to get answers to those questions? How much time do I spend in terms of making sure that I get the right level of benefit information to enable somebody's enrolled in the right plan at the right time, whether that's sending the reports to different carriers across the world, or whether that's just making sure the file's even in the right format, so actually those carriers can read those pieces. So I think what's really telling is that that frustration point around the admin and the compliance is actually a huge opportunity for a number of organisations, because it becomes easier to quantify some of the return on investment opportunities that exist, and quantify them in such a way that actually when we're putting the business case forward, it becomes easier to really make that claim, so that yes, the sales team in your organisation might have that really glossy PowerPoint with a whole host of metrics from their CRM system, but here are some really tangible ways for an organisation to demonstrate the value of an investment in the experience that they're looking to provide for employees. So I don't think it's a surprise perhaps to see admin and compliance feature so heavily, and I think it only magnifies when you step out of a single territory, for example, and just trying to juggle all of those different facets.